The following is an interview with Bob Nelson recorded on June 27, 2025, in Yorkville, Illinois, about his book, LBJ's Mortal Wound, The Don Reynolds Story.
November 22nd, 1963, and all of a sudden, we're involved in a national event. My uncle was testifying at that very moment when Kennedy's car was turning on Elm Street in Dallas. My uncle was testifying at that very moment against the Vice President of the United States. My uncle Don Reynolds was my godfather. He was the man who was going to shepherd me through life, even though he lived in Maryland and we lived in Chicago. He was the gentleman that our family decided was going to be my godfather. And it was an incredible story of I enjoyed so much the summers I had with him and his wife as we boated on Deep Creek Lake and the wonderful experiences that we had. But life is never predictable, so to speak, and so we were thrown into history at that. Both my uncle, Don Buck Reynolds, and Robert Gene Baker, who wrote his own story, the Bobby Baker story, they were both from South Carolina, and they both worked in Washington, D.C. So when my uncle was looking for clients for his insurance business, Robert Gene Baker introduced my uncle, Don Buck Reynolds, to then Vice President Lyndon Johnson for an insurance policy. My uncle specialized in insurance, and he was a very, very sharp insurance salesman. So that's how that connection came about, a South Carolina connection to Lyndon Johnson. Bobby Baker was the Senate Secretary to the Senate Majority. He was the intelligence man of the United States Senate. He wrote his own story, Wheeling and Dealing, and he was very good friends with Lyndon Baines Johnson. And he knew where the bodies were buried, so to speak. But I decided that I wanted a personal story about our family and how we were affected. And Bobby Baker has written a story, Wheeling and Dealing, which he mentions my uncle. And we had been in various newspapers across the country. So it's not something that has been bereft of information. I call it a tale of three cities: Dallas, New York, and Washington. I dare say that I don't think very many people know that all three of those cities at the same moment were involved. As Kennedy's car is turning on Elm Street, there is Life magazine is assembling a story on Lyndon Johnson, a huge story. I spoke with James Wagenford, the man who was in that newsroom. At that point, perhaps Lyndon Johnson would be done with and finished. At that same moment in Washington, D.C., my uncle was handing out documents on the corruption of Lyndon Johnson to Senate investigators. So, when this all happens, the documents are shredded at Life, and my uncle's testimony goes through, but it's not in the form that we wanted it to be. But a family friend had told me at one point that Hoover had contacted him and said, "Don, we are both Masons, Freemasons. So in that spirit, I want to tell you, Don, it's best that you leave the country. Leave the country, Don. If you don't, LBJ will have you killed." We lived in a street in Munster, Indiana, and my mom and I came home one day. She was a teacher at a school, and she says, "Bob, it's so cold outside. Why don't you come back with me in the car?" I said, "Thanks, Mom. I appreciate that, you know." So we drove into the garage. My mom looked in the rearview mirror and said, "Here they come, Bob." So as a 10-year-old, I looked back and I saw two men with black coats and hats approaching our garage. And they flashed the badges that said FBI. And said, "We're looking for a man named Don Reynolds." And my mom turned the question to me. She says, "We haven't seen him lately, have we, Bob?" So she turned the question to me as a 10-year-old to answer the feds. And I said, no, we haven't seen him lately. Well, that was not exactly true. He had been at the house maybe 3 days before. But the part two of the surveillance was there was always a car parked across the street at our house. And my dad walked up to the car and said to the agent inside, he says, I don't think it's the best thing to do to have you watching a 10-year-old kid go to school every day. They were seeing me come out of the house and walk to school. And my dad wanted to impart a very, shall we say, message to them to please leave and not come back. But I don't think that worked very well. I felt a memoir was in order. I felt that as a family we had gone through so much and that the human side of it had not been told. Yes, there are documents. Yes, there are the historical timelines. But how were we affected as a family? What did that do to us? And what were the personal decisions involved in the story? So I would say in a short answer, the personal side of it was important. It raises questions about whistleblowing. It raises questions about the legacy of a president. It raises questions about how do we deal with family conflict? And this could be universally applicable to people in various degrees and at various times and with various issues. It's available online. It's available at major retailers. So it's not something you have to go to Australia to get. LBJ's Mortal Wound, the Don Reynolds story, details a lot of the story, and I think that could be a very, very useful resource for people. I was a recording fanatic when I was a kid. 10 years old, 11 years old, my father had given me a tape recorder, but I also had a special recording device I attached to the phone, those old phones at that time. And I had recorded the conversation of my uncle when he called in. And I remember one of the conversations I had with him. It's on the recording. He says, "Bob, you got a good mind, but don't let people try to contaminate it, Bob." I said, I won't, Uncle Buck. He says, "Bob, keep looking." This was his advice now on the tape. "Keep looking. Don't take anybody's word, but keep checking. Okay, Bob?" And that was, I thought that was exciting. Greg Smith is a man who, when we were living in Madison, Wisconsin, did some FOIA research requests. And we found out there were roughly 17,000 pages of documents on my uncle that had been recorded, available. They're there, but we only got roughly about 70 pages, I guess, of documents from the feds at this time. Mm-hmm. No, it's the title was called LBJ's Mortal Wound, the Don Reynolds story. And people may ask, well, what's the mortal wound? Wasn't that JFK? Well, I think my uncle's story put a mortal wound in LBJ's legacy. Mollenhoff was a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. He wrote The Spoilers of Democracy, and he wrote a chapter in his book, Testimony During Disaster, in which he detailed the story of my uncle being caught up into history. It's quite riveting. My uncle did not want to impart the scandal in its full blazing color to me, but he did want to, he did want me to learn certain lessons from that. And that's part of the reason why that on a telephone conversation, which I mentioned before, he said that your mind is inquiring, you get a good mind, but don't let people try to contaminate it. In other words, he felt there was some ulterior motives that would influence me in the wrong way. He wanted me to keep an open mind, to keep looking, but don't take anybody's word. But keep checking with me, Bob. Keep in contact with me. That's what I remember about him.